it also influenced the various Hindu communities and other non-Hindu but nonetheless Indic traditions, of which Buddhism, is an Indic tradition. And so all these Indic traditions, it makes sense that they share a common cultural background, common heritage. So you will see a lot of similarities in the vocabulary, especially that they use. Although every system will have its own kind of nuance and take on this vocabulary and all that. But there's certainly a lot of overlaps. And then you also have individuals who spend their time delineating, the differences between the nuances. These are like the more mainstream institution-based efforts. Of course, even institution-based, it's individuals. Institution doesn't exist as a thing. But then there's also those who, another, you could say, dynamic that tended to ignore these differences that are being articulated. I don't see them as necessarily opposed. And some of you might be more attracted to the non-institutionalized aspects, which in our context, Milarepa represents that. Yeah? Then the more institutionalized efforts to clarify the differences and therefore highlight in some ways, right? The strength and the power of a particular articulation, which in our context would be, I think, symbolized by Bonpo and his descendants. So anyway, where I was going with this, talking about sticking things up your nose. The back of your tongue, there's this little uvula, is it what it's called? Yeah. So a little thing kind of hanging down. So among both Hindu and Buddhist and other Indic traditions in the 12th, 13th century that were influenced by this wave of Tantra and Tantric methods and Tantric kind of orientation. There is a practice that they call the Kechari, like Kechara, Kechari, which means like celestial realm, the Kechari method. And I was just reading about this. I was reading it in the context of a Buddhist, a Tibetan Buddhist critique of this, saying that there's no point investing your time in such practices, even though it's well attested in Buddhist texts, like certain, it's by no means like everybody agreed, both, it's a wonderful thing, I think, that there's lots of space for different opinions to exist within the family. So this Tibetan writer, I think maybe 15th century, was criticizing like Buddhists who spend their time working on this. So the technique involves somehow training your tongue, to go touch the uvula and to like tickle it until some kind of like charged sensation arises, where they say that then the bliss will rain down from the sky, as in that's like the sky of your mouth, And don't want to scandalize anyone. This is clearly related to like sexual where two people are involved. But there's a movement in Tantra to also go inwards, so that it's kind of desexualized in a way. And so it's a weird sort of like reenactment of some kind of coitus with your tongue and the uvula, to bring up, these kind of like powerful experiences. The same writer goes on to also even criticize the practice of tummo, which we know clearly, Milarepa practice and even Gampopa's disciples practice. But this writer is quite unique. He said, this tummo stuff, this, Kechari stuff, and the four bliss and all of that, he says all these efforts to, the gist of his criticism is all these efforts to artificially create a heightened, I guess you could say, like peak experiences. He is distrustful of all of that. He says, all of these, yes, maybe it can help certain people, but overall, all it does is that it leads you into being more addicted to peak experiences. And he says, give up, on investing your time and effort on those things. Because he says there's a much more natural way. Because even like those who say you use these methods, they will admit and say, it is just a way to powerfully manipulate experience and energy and, what the human body is capable of. It's to artificially like create those conditions so that the mind, because during those times, the mind is so powerful, but it could be powerfully like engrossed in and therefore attached in something. But the rationale here is that you can turn that around so that that powerful state of mind can cut through layers and layers of confusion. But this writer says, it wasn't just a writer. I mean, in Tibet, you don't just have writers. These are also great masters who experience do these practices. And this particular Lama, he said, no, he said, this is just, leave all these things aside, because, and he's not like a prude. It's not like oh, no fun, he's actually saying this based on, I believe, based on his kind of sense that there is already here, without manipulating, a natural kind of bliss that can arise without going through all these manipulations. So in some ways you can say that he trusts that if you know how to quiet the mind and to quiet the mind and to look at it, without manipulating it, you too can powerfully cut through confusion without needing to harness rather, through methods that you can get trapped in. I think this takes us back to 60s, Timothy Leary, and they were experimenting. These were not like recreational drug users, right? At Harvard and places like that, really intelligent minds were experimenting to see if there is a way to cut through, right, the limitations that we have put our mind, our consciousness into. And of course, some powerfully cut through and became free, but probably majority got trapped. So anyway, that's what I've been reading. And So a lot of, so coming back to our material, Milarepa certainly, did these practices, but I would say Milarepa was such an extraordinary case, So sometimes I feel that the life stories of the great masters can equally inspire or mislead if you don't know how to read them.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes, sure.
I always thought that tumo was just a practical thing, that you could just stay warm when...
Oh, no. In fact, they make fun of that. They say, if you were doing that, they say, then you would be better off, like just getting, better, jacket or something. In fact, they make fun of that. They say, no, tumo is not for that. In fact, the heat that is generated is just a side effect. It's because the mind has become so focused and powerful. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Then, of course, they also got into the habit of then demonstrating how much heat the body has. So that is a form of sidetrack, I would say. So even in monasteries, they would like once a year, gather all the retreatants in the coldest night of the year, and doing this, laundry drying service, service in both senses of the word, it's ritualized, but it's also perhaps a service, and they would like dip these like cotton cloth, you can find on YouTube, into icy cold water, and then they lay it on the backs of these yogis, and then you see steam arising, and then one sheet dry, one down, and then there's a row of them, see who can dry how many sheets in, within an hour. In part, that is maybe the monastery's way of being accountable to the patrons, to the donors, and say, so I don't want to see it as just boastful, but it's in a way, right? These societies have worked out ways to kind of hold each other accountable. And so if the laity is to support us, we have to somehow show them we are serious about this. We're not just eating your food and spending your money and not doing anything in particular. But of course, it can become a sidetrack, like. Yeah, so the heat that is, and they have measured this scientifically in the labs in the West. The heat that is generated is measurable, so it's not, like just woo-woo. It's measurable, but they say very clearly that that is a side effect. The main point is still that the mind becomes so powerful. And the bliss that is generated is part of this potency of the mind. This Tibetan Lama that criticized this, he was in the origin of the criticism. In fact, he's commenting on Saraha. Saraha was one of the great Mahasiddhas of that period, when the tantric movement really swept across India. 11, 12, 13th century was like, you could say, the height of the tantric orientation, sweeping all across India. So they're all spiritual traditions of various types, in one way or another, kind of develop their own way of appropriating, I would say, this tantric orientation, including the Muslims that were already in India at that time. Later, Muslims came later, 14th, 15th century, but even the Muslims, in a lot of Muslim writings, they talk about, they were very impressed by the Indians' yogic abilities. so that when Sufism came into India, again, the orientation is the basic Sufi worldview is fundamentally Muslim. I think in the popularization of Sufi in the West, that has been lost. But all Sufi orders, legitimate Sufi orders, they are firmly parked in Islam. But they recognize the yogic technology that the Indians had. So they too took these practices. So this morning I was listening to BBC International. So if you look at my Facebook, I shared a quote from a Kashmiri woman saint called Laleshwari or Mother Lala. And clearly Mother Lala or Laleshwari was someone who operated, she it's fuzzy exactly when she lived, but probably around 14th century. So 14th century is when Buddhism started, was already mostly declined, but still around in that area. And Islam is like becoming stronger and stronger in area. So today Kashmir is, majority Muslim. But from Laleshwari's poetry, it's very clear that those lines are all still kind of fuzzy. She was Hindu, as in born in a Hindu family. But then she has these long-standing exchanges with Sufi figures. And so there's a story how one of the great Sufi masters of that time that came to that area, like there's an anecdote, a story where he asked her, do you want to meet God? I have a way of taking us there. And she said, sure. And so they went on this, what we would call shamanic journey. So the Sufi master and her traveled through. So in the Islamic understanding, there are these 7 kind of levels in heaven. And in traditional Muslim theology, certain beings have access to certain levels, then the saints, then the prophets, and then the highest is where God actually is. So it said that in this journey, the Sufi master that took Laleshwari, he wasn't able to get to the level that Laleshwari had access to. And he himself was surprised, when they kind of reached that level, that Laleshwari got to the throne of God, which is at the 7th level, and the Sufi master was at 6th level. And then when they came back down to ordinary reality, the Sufi master said, would you carry on my teachings? And she agreed. But the interviewers, the program, they interviewed 3 of these experts on her, said that there's no evidence either in Laleshwari's story that she converted to Islam. And then in a lot of her poetry, she sings about shunyata, emptiness. So that Buddhist element is still very strong. Even probably there were no active Buddhist communities in her time. So how did I get to Laleshwari? Anyway, sidetrack, right? So one thing I wanted to say is, and then in this program, the interviewer said, so were there like conflict like between Hindus and Muslims, and to whatever degree there were Buddhists? And so one of the scholars interviewed said, the real conflict wasn't so much between Hindus and Muslims per se. The real tension was between those who want to draw the lines very clearly between traditions and those who didn't care for those lines. And Laleshwari was clearly the one that belonged over here. And then there were those who were, felt the importance of drawing lines. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind, that, perhaps the conflict, even in broader sense, when we talk about religious conflict today, one way to reframe what we think the problem is not between Muslims and Hindus or Muslims and Christians, but it's really between those who want to draw these lines and say that these lines are so important. And even beyond that, it's the line between right and wrong and heaven and hell, and those who don't care to draw these lines and to say, that there are qualities that transcend all these lines, and living these qualities are much more important. Yeah. Karen, I think you've been wanting to say something. I've noticed. Trying to look at the camera, but corner of my eye, I see the computer.
No, I mean, that all fascinates me when you were talking about, but you answered my question. It was the yogic technology,
Mm-hmm.
in India. And that whole
Mm-hmm.
time is just um, fascinating
Yeah.
because, like I'm going through some acupuncture stuff
Mm-hmm.
now. And it's just to open up the chi,
Mm-hmm.
which you could do if you, did the Buddhist practices,
Mm-hmm.
which just makes it easier to, to open yourself up
Yes.
to be able to do your Buddhist practice.
Mm-hmm.
And, like yoga and, so many of these, like you say, technologies that help
Yes.
get you there.
Yes.
There's, and it's fascinating, especially, the history in India.
Yeah.
That's, the thing about the acupuncture is, nothing lasts forever. You can spend
Yes.
$1,000 on 10 treatments, and then in a week you're still, back where you were.
Yes.
So,
Good thing or bad thing, right?
well, it's a wonderful high for about, 3 hours afterwards. It's excellent.
It seems
Then,
like
yeah, go on, Jim.
Oh, okay, thank you. It seems like I'm just testing my understanding, really, asking you this. It seems like I'm asking whether this way of thinking is kind of correct, I guess. That from a non-conceptual state, all the different approaches, all the different lineages, all the different religions are just concepts pointing at the
Mm-hmm.
state. And from that point of view, that's the transcendent state, I think you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And is that,
well, even those who,
it's not like these aren't needed, and they're essential to get
mm-hmm.
to an understanding.
I think for those who draw those lines, the most generous of those who draw those lines and emphasize the importance of those lines, they would say, sure, but that is on the end result point. We are not at that point. So here we need to figure out. Yeah. So they say, then if you keep talking about in the end, you're like, they say, well, you're not at the end yet.
Right. You have to choose one way up the mountain.
Yeah.
You can't just keep switching at the base.
Yeah.
Well, you can, but you'll stay at the base.
Right. So the most generous ones would say that, right? The least generous ones of those who like to draw lines would say, no, it's a matter of right and wrong, heaven and hell. Right. Then the most generous ones, I would say among Buddhists, who insist on drawing those lines, they will say, yes, of course, when Buddhahood is achieved, all these differences will be understood as temporary and, not important, da, 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 da. But they say on this end of confusion, however, the more sharply we have our tools all laid out, then the more efficiently they can be used for the surgery that needs to be done. But many of these Mahasiddhas defy these clearly drawn lines. I think overall, as a pattern, you can say that many of these Mahasiddhas defy those lines. Then in contemporary times, you can see how forest monks, for example, in Thailand, compared to city monks, again, you see that divide. The city monks are very invested in these lines. Forest monks are not that concerned about these lines. Then among Tibetan contexts too, like if you want to just simplistically talk about lineage differences, Gelugpas are most concerned about these lines, right? And Gagyupas in some way are the least concerned about these lines. And that it's more about, and here the lines are not even like between Buddhists and non-Buddhists, but within the context of, Tibetan Buddhism. The Gagyupas are more like, experience is much more important. Theorizing is secondary, and just figure out the right amount of theorizing that you need, and then go experience this. And that's somewhat Milarepa. I think there's an earlier layer to these Milarepa songs where they have not been so clean up. Because I'm working with a couple of translators on 12th century collections of teachings that we know were written down in the 12th century, and then nobody, for good or for bad, I think for good, nobody in a later period went through to clean up things. They just left it as it is. So these are like teachings of the founder of Drikung Kagyu. So the translators who are much more familiar with like 17th, 18th century, 16th, 17th, 18th century Tibetan Buddhist literature, they have translated quite a number of these things. And time and again, when I talk to them, they said, they are both like excited and sometimes frustrated with this 12th century collection, because you never know when a curveball is going to come. Because things are not so, codified. So I think Milarepa songs, as we know, this collection, right? If you want to be very like academic about it, you can only say that they came from the 16th century. Because Zangyong Heruka lived in the 16th century. And he put this together as a volume. So he gathered a lot of Milarepa traditions and songs, from various sources. And then he strung them all together, and this volume came about, So if you want to be very objective about this, you cannot say, that this came from the 11th century. In fact, I think a linguist, if they went into really analyzing this, and in that sense, actually, Western scholars who have worked on Christianity and the history of Christianity, they have developed those tools, that if there is someone who have those tools and can read Tibetan language and have the degree of training in old and new Tibetan language, they will be able to detect these language patterns that appear here that you cannot date back to the 12th, 11th century. That a hand, right, has already gone through in the 16th century. But yeah, in the 12th century material that I've been working with these two translators, they say you just never know when a curveball will come. You think you know where he's going with this, then suddenly, what? And you don't even know. Whereas a lot of these later things, the minute they use one word, you're like, okay, I know where this is going. Yeah, I often tell this anecdote about, right, in this happened, within the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. Yeah, a lama came from a very kind of rural area in Eastern Tibet, came to Taiwan, invited by some people because, he was very highly regarded in that area. Then he came but he spoke a dialect that was so thick that even all the monks in Eastern Tibet who are living in Taiwan have a hard time understanding him. I mean, they understood enough of him, to kind of like get simple things done. So this older lama is scheduled to give a talk, and someone is supposed to translate him. But nobody, could understand him. So finally, one young monk said, youngish, Kempo said, yeah, I can translate him. And so then he translated him into Chinese. And then afterwards, his colleagues are like, where did you learn this dialect? Like, he was like, no, I never learned it. And they're like, so what? How did you translate? He said, I'm educated. I know what he's going to talk about. I can catch the vocabulary. And I just said what I think he's saying. So he didn't quite translate, He just said whatever he thought the Lama was saying. And then, of course, he had a point. He was like, we can't tell the audience, nobody understands him, when everyone is already gathered there. He's talking about bodhicitta. Like, how many ways can you talk about bodhicitta?
So funny.
It's like, I knew, when I heard the word two at the beginning, and then I heard absolute and heard relative. Yeah, I know everything about absolute and relative bodhicitta. Then within relative bodhicitta, there's aspiration and engagement. I caught those words and I caught the examples that he was given. So then I just said what I knew he was saying, so it has become very predictable, So yeah, if you have read one, generally speaking, starting from 16th century on, if you have read one teaching on bodhicitta, you can track, how that gets repeated, no matter which lama gives it. There's a particular form, But if you go back to the earlier material, it's still all, So anyway, big round point. The lama that was critiquing these techniques, he didn't come up with the critique himself. He was expanding on, so there is 3 sets of these Vajra songs by this great Mahasiddha called Saraha, the arrow maker, called the king cycle, the minister cycle, and the citizen cycle. It's like 3 collections. They're just called the king cycle, the minister cycle, and this ordinary citizen cycle. So in the king cycle, and that cycle I think has been taught by Trungpa Rinpoche, in the king cycle, Saraha himself criticized these methods. So even among the Mahasiddha community, where these tantric methods and techniques were heavily used, Saraha himself, one of the greatest of the Mahasiddhas, he criticized this. He said, all these efforts, all these contrived efforts, at best, they can kind of deliver 1 or 2 people, but for the most part, it will keep a lot of people trapped. That it's better that we just, go to the natural way, and that's sufficient. So the king Doha. The King Doha is called by Saraha. They have critiques like that.
How do you
Of these
spell
men.
Sarahat?
Yep.
How do you spell Sarahat?
Saraha, Saraha. Saraha. Another footnote, a lot of these yogic techniques, interestingly, the oldest written record of these techniques that we have, if we privilege written over oral, but then if you want to argue from oral evidence, it's neither here nor there. How do you argue, how ancient an oral tradition is, right? The material prejudice is this. Yeah? So the oldest written evidence that we have of such techniques being developed, being taught, being experimented by, comes from China. So it has led some even leading scholars of Indian Tantra to say that they believe that these techniques might actually have come from China to India at some point. But of course, no definitive answer to that question. Because there are texts there are Hindu texts that talks about how these techniques came from China. Actually, explicitly, they call it Mahachina, like great China. They say the tantric path. And these are Hindu texts that are critical of Tantra. Yeah? So how do you insult, someone? You say that, it's the China virus or the China technique,
China.
So even in ancient India, you already have people using the other, to insult, your competitors in your own area. So calling like the tantric technology as something that came from, China. Some patterns don't die easily; they get repeated. Yeah. So anyway, this is and Milarepa, certainly practiced these techniques, which he learned from primarily from Marpa. Marpa spent, close to 20 years, I think, going back and forth between Tibet and Nepal and India, and brought back these transmissions. Then in the hands of Gampopa, you see maybe you can say a de-emphasis on these contrived methods and kind of a balancing of things. Gampopa did practice this for sure, but the direction he took them is different from Milarepa's.
Dr. Lai,
Yes.
last week we read the 22nd song, Pro Bonchung, which was all about this battle over a mountain between, it was very interesting. But it's the same thing I think you're talking about to some extent. You had the Bon master and the Buddhist master.
Yes.
In this silly war kind of between who could fly to the top of the mountain quicker and stuff.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
It was fun, but I don't know very much. I don't know if there's a question about it, but I just don't know very much about that interaction between what was there in Tibet when the Buddhists.
Right. So again, it's hard to tell. Is this about 11th century or is this about 16th century?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's that. Then the term Bun is, notoriously difficult to track in Tibetan history.
Mm.
As in, what we have today as Bonpo is not, for sure, what Bonpo was in, 10th, 11th century.
Yeah. Yeah.
What we have as Bonpo today, for all intents and purposes, is a Buddhist system. In fact, Bön teachers in the West would even hyphenate, if you look carefully, they would say, Bön Buddhist, hyphenate that. But in the 16th century, when, Zhang Heruka was putting this together, by that point, this Bön Buddhist is clearly already in place, right? So it could be that they were having some turf stuff going on with this Bön Buddhist tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But it could also be, I don't know enough to say for sure. I'm making educated guesses.
Yeah.
That it could also be that it's a non-existing category in Zhang Heruka's area, simply to demonstrate Milarepa's kind of, so you use a straw man, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you talk about Bonpos, right? And then there is nobody, right, within a 300, mile radius that is Bonpo. Yeah, so it's kind of like inconsequential.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it becomes consequential when later on the basis of this, right, Buddhists behave badly against Bonpos.
Yeah. Well, if you look at the, there's actually a question, the guy actually asks him on page 229, the Bonpo asks him, what's the difference between your mind and mine? What's the difference between Bun and Buddhism?
Yeah, yeah.
And then on 230, Milarepa answers him and says, basically, it's that the Bonpos are depending on gods.
Yes,
to
right.
empower their miracles, but he has self-arised wisdom.
Yes.
And
yeah.
So there you have it.
Right. And also then the way to read that would be, the way to read that, right, is to me, whenever I read, something like this, rather than thinking of this Bonpo as actually like, a Muslim or a Christian, right?
Yeah.
The critique here then, so we could as easily replace this with Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you pray to your God and you think your God is doing things for you.
Right.
Me, I understand that it's my own mind, right?
Okay.
That is creating happiness and suffering, right? So the way we should read this is almost like, who cares if it's Bön or whatever, that in fact, am I now practicing as a quote unquote Buddhist, or am I now practicing as a quote unquote Bonpo?
Yeah.
Am I practicing as a theist, or am I practicing, in the non-theistic tradition of the Buddha Dharma? So that in the end, it has nothing to do with other religions. It's sort of your own attitude. Because in a way, theism and the belief in gods, it has nothing to do with any religious tradition. It's a very ingrained confusion
Mm-hmm.
that is completely normal, by the way.
Right.
As I've talked about this before, I don't know if you remember, like it's completely normal and reasonable, the belief in God or goddess, as this external being that brings happiness or suffering depending on whether we are doing what they want us to do or not, right? Or even when you conceptualize them as completely altruistic, this god or goddess, and therefore, no matter what you do, unconditionally, they will love you, right?
Right.
I mean, all of this we learn from the womb to today. When you first came out of the womb, you look up, right? Every time you are uncomfortable, and maybe you're not even registering, oh, that's hunger. Oh, that's poo,
Yeah.
And that wetness is just, oh, yuck, wah, 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 wah. And then a face turns up, right? And then magically that discomfort disappears. I mean, that's the basis of there is someone that is going to make me happy. There is someone that's going to make me miserable. If you have loving parents, you gravitate to an all-loving, accepting God, goddess. If you have, inattentive parents, you're more likely to imagine, relate to a God that is unpredictable. And if you're unfortunate enough, the circumstance, you have abusive parents, then you can have a very punitive God. You can track all of that, based on. And so it's quite normal. And in that sense, then the Buddha Dharma is very abnormal. It wants us to undo that whole dependency. Regardless of how you think of God as benevolent or unpredictable, or punitive, right? The Buddha Dharma is getting us to undo that kind of conditioning. In a way, you could say it's not normal. Yeah. But we want to say that's natural. But the belief, so when Milarepa says, so you guys depend on these gods, to me, he's speaking to, those times where I think, my happiness and suffering can be improved or made worse, by gods and demons out there that I can manipulate. Yeah. And we learn how to manipulate God, right? AKA parents. We learn how to curry their favor, right? We learn how to manipulate them. So as long as we're still manipulating whether our parents or gods or demons, and not understand, a deeper level of what actually is going on, then we are quote unquote bumpers. We are quote unquote theists. So there are lots of theists among Buddhists. And there are lots of non-theists among Christians too. So there are a lot of Dharma practitioners among who we call Bonpos today. Just as there are a lot of Bonpos among, Buddhist practitioners today. That's how I would read that chapter.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to tell y'all.
Mm-hmm.
I have a group of friends. They're AA women. They're older. They're very Southern. They're very liberal. They hate Trump.
Bless their hearts.
I know. Yeah. And so we Zoom. We're Thursday night, ladies' night out, but now we Zoom 3 times a week. And so the other day we were talking about praying,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, well, I pray for Trump, and I
Mhm.
knew that they would just go out of their mind, out of their minds. I mean, like off the planet. And one of the girls said, I cannot pray for Trump because I would be a hypocrite.
Uh-huh.
And I thought I was going to die that she would say that she doesn't get it at all.
But she's right. She would be a hypocrite if she
No,
prayed
she
for.
wouldn't. I mean,
No, she would be because she doesn't
why?
love him. She
So,
would.
don't you have a
The
bigger
literal
God?
definition of a hypocrite, which is her actions of praying, doesn't match how she feels about Trump.
But
So
can't you say, like what I've been taught in Buddhism,
yes,
is, for example, to have an intention that I wish one day, that I could do this,
yeah,
or
but I think
open
she's
up.
being honest. She said, "I can't get there." So we have to be able to see that, you know.
I couldn't see it.
Yeah, well, you have to develop the capacity. That's the wisdom part. Like, at least she's being honest. Like, no, like I right now cannot wish well on this person. You know, it doesn't mean you have to stop praying for Trump because you can see, you know, and this is why we are different. This is sometimes I said, you know, sometimes we are shy to think that we are different. We are. If you have taken refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, if you understand the Dharma, you should be different. And then when you see other people, they're not able to get to that place, then they are not able.
Well, I was able to move on because I
Yeah.
do understand.
Yeah, yeah.
But I just wanted to share it with somebody. It was like, I just wanted to share it because I didn't have anybody to share it with. And, you're right. And
Yeah.
I mean, we do. We have to accept everybody just exactly the way they are. No eye rolling and no, it's just people are who they are.
Yeah.
And the more you get to know them, the more you get to kind of like it. And I love this girl. I love
Oh,
her
yeah,
a lot.
yeah, yeah.
But
So I think like, you know, like in a literal definition of hypocrite is, you know, saying one thing and doing another thing. So
well, and see, I was being the hypocrite, and I was being the hypocrite of saying that she was a hypocrite.
That's
So
right.
we have to just
Aisha,
we have to check our motives.
yeah. Aisha, did you say something?
Yes, I have. Okay, so I've been hanging. So I've been doing rituals with Moon Goddess.
Uh-huh.
So I'm with this group, and we meet monthly, and we do rituals for each cycle of the moon.
Mm-hmm.
And so you were talking about goddess and gods and all of this, and it coming from mind. Well, there has been, and I never knew her. Her name is Hecate,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've had some really, I'm at my mom's house. I stopped in front of her house. But anyway, some really real experiences
Mm-hmm.
with what her symbols are. And
Mm-hmm.
so is that really my own mind, or is that, because now it's that same thing like praying to Hecate, this
Uh-huh.
goddess, the triple
Mm-hmm.
moon goddess.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I don't know if I have a real question there.
Yeah, whether it's Hecate or whether it's Tara, you know, it could be a theistic relationship or it could be a non-theistic relationship. You know. So from the kind of definitive teachings of the Buddha is to say you have to get to a point where it's a non-theistic relationship. But just because it's a theistic relationship, it doesn't mean it's bad.
Right.
You know, again, we have to recognize where we are. Yeah. Right? There's so much, for example, you know, love and compassion, right, among Christians, even if their view is very theistic. And Dalai Lama said, we have to recognize that. And so then he said, when my Christian brothers and sisters ask me about emptiness, he said, I don't talk to them about emptiness, because part of the critique of emptiness involves deconstructing the notion of God. And he said, it's not appropriate to talk to my Christian brothers and sisters, because that is their basis of generating love and compassion. So then I have to recognize and respect that. And more importantly is to generate love and compassion, which is what we need today, he says. Yeah. So he is another example, even though his institution, oh my God, right? Dalai Lama is like, right? The Tibetan institution depends on him, right? But he's more, not concerned about drawing those lines. And that gets some Tibetans very annoyed, including Tibetan Buddhist teachers, including Tibetan Buddhist teachers who are supposedly on the less interested in drawing line side. Some Nyingma I've seen, not openly, but I know they criticize the Dalai Lama and say, what has he become? They think it's all just he's being a clever politician. No, I don't think so. It's like he's really, there's that side where he knows he's responsible for the whole, culture and everything, the way people hang their hopes on him. But at the same time, he's doing so much to emphasize, love and compassion beyond borders, beyond identity. That's what we need today. That's what we need to focus on. So when he gave the Avalokiteshvara empowerment, you could tell that he was even offering it to non-Buddhists, and that scandalized some Buddhists, And he said, but, this is about love and compassion. And if you want to accept this, I will give it to you. And in the first place, I think, he didn't explicitly say that, but if you know how to hear what he's saying, he's even saying, in the first place, it's not for me to give or not to give. I'm just here to facilitate. Then there are the Buddhist dogmatists, I guess you could call them that. They're like, well, he's not supposed to do this publicly, blah, 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 all of that, It's like, no, now is not the time. Now is not the time.
So can I ask you then, if we're practicing with a deity, like Aisha's asking and like what you're doing with Tara, what makes it okay is that we know that we're invoking the deity as a way to work. She's arising out of her own mind. She is our own mind. And we're not, it's so tricky. It's kind of like so tricky to know when are you like, where's
okay. My 2 cents on that, don't worry about it.
Oh, thank you. I like that.
Because we can also overthink this and over-worry this. You trust that, as your experience deepens, you will navigate yourself away from it, or you will meet the conditions in which you can navigate yourself away from it.
Okay.
I think there's also too much theoretical worry about, am I or am I not? Okay. It's understandable, I get that, So, but even like, right, the notion of is it okay? I think that already, we're assuming like this is, again, so even that I feel is a theistic statement, right? Wait, who's okaying it?
Yeah.
So okay or not, like trusting our own, it's sort of like, of course, right? The way this works is it's good to develop an understanding of what you would call, in this case, right? What's okay, right? Which is another way of saying, what is the fundamental view, right? But then to also recognize, like, while that is the fundamental view, that is the fundamental understanding, which is, in this case, we say non-theistic, it's also okay, so to say, right? To recognize that right now, it's a mix of both theistic and non-theistic.
Mhm.
And you cannot deny this. You cannot, like, judge this and punish yourself and say, bad boy,
Mhm.
you still believe these things. But this is where you are.
Yeah.
This is where I am developmentally, even though I know here is where I want to get to, right?
Yeah.
So you work with this. Right? And for sure, don't yell at yourself, you notice, you recognize, then you continue to practice. And as you spiritually mature, no one really needs to tell you to give up your toys. You will relate to your toys differently. I think over concern about the toys becomes unhealthy too.
Yeah.
Can I ask
Yes.
something, Dr. Lai? Learning and trying to work with the Tara practices.
Mm-hmm.
Is this correct about, part of the practice is actually trying to experience the presence or manifesting presence of the deity
Mm-hmm.
as an external thing,
Mm-hmm.
and going with that, and then learning just not to conceptualize about it afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
just sort of trying to make it as vivid as possible, and then giving yourself the experience of that, of dissolving that,
Mm-hmm.
somehow, so that you don't, you relate to projections of the world, the phenomenal
Yes.
world, in the same way that we don't, you're also
Yes.
dissolving that.
Without fixating. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but nevertheless, we're also giving us it's like the generating thing of, like, look, I can manifest reality out of my mind. This experience is transparent as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we go with it emotionally, we go with it devotionally, and that's all. But we want to go conceptual with it afterwards. We want to go, well, is that real or not real?
Mm-hmm.
But the experience, as an experience, is real.
Yes.
Too.
Right. Yeah. And so those are the things that we learn, through the practice. And we want to practice with awareness, like with understanding, with, like, noticing, to notice,
Yeah.
to reflect, to notice and to reflect, and to trust the process, and not fear, quote unquote, making mistakes. Because if we don't make mistakes, we don't grow.
Mhm.
And sometimes the mistake needs to be around for a while to gain enough momentum to give rise to insight.
Thank you.
Again and again, I say to people, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't be so hard on yourself.
My best trick, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm really good at that.
There's no God, there's no Dharma cop, Milarepa. Speaking of, Bonpo, yeah. Yeah, so it's hard to tell, right? Who these Bonpos are when he talks about Bonpos, right? Or when this book talks about Bonpos.
Right.
To this day, again, right, even among the Bonpo whose representatives are found now in the US and in the West, operating centers and all of that, for sure, these are not the Bonpos that we're talking about here. Then even among the Bonpos, like with the centers here in the West, even among their own categorizing Bonpos, they categorize into what they call I guess you could say, vocabulary, I'm not very familiar, but basically they differentiate between the like authentic Bonpo, and then they say the Bonpos who, make animal sacrifices to appease worldly deities. So they have a category like that. They say those are also Bonpos, but those Bonpos are, really, really bad. Yeah. So they call their own Bon, what the teachers of Bonpo who teach in the West, they say those are Yundrung Bon. Yungdrun. Yungdrun is the swastika.
Right.
Of course, in the Asian context, nothing to do with Hitler. So their proper name for their spiritual tradition is Yundrung Bon. Yeah. So then that means even for them, there are other types of Bon that exist. And those are the ones who try to coerce spirits and gods and like negotiate, I give you 2 chickens, and you give me good harvest, and I give you,
Right.
So even among the Bon, and then among the Yundrun Bon, it's like you cannot tell the difference between what they're doing and the so-called Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists are doing. I think I've told this story before. Like one time we had a retreat in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the Dragoon group there is very small, so we don't have a center or anything. We meet in people's basements, and then for this retreat, we decided we needed a bigger space, a neutral space, so to say. So we rented a facility to use. So the teacher was a Khenpo that came from Nepal, and before that from Tibet. And so we went to this space and we did retreat, Saturday all day, went to lunch, came back. Sunday, again, while coming back from lunch, as we were walking back to the center, I said to the Khenpo, I said, this facility, this center, and the center was like a Tibetan Buddhist center. Yeah, they rent out their space, and it's not like EBS, it's more like a Tibetan Buddhist center, tankas and statues and everything, And then I said to the Khenpo, I said, I said, this Ligmincha has been around for a while, and then Khenpo said, what lineage are they? I said, they are Bonpos. He's like, what? They're Bonpos? I said, yeah. He's like, oh, I didn't notice. Because you would not notice until it's pointed out to you. So even for a Khenpo, so when we got back to the center, he looked closely at the tankas and he said, oh, yeah, they kind of hold different things. Only when he looked very closely, he was like, oh, right. Yeah, it is a Bonpo center. Completely it's not even obvious. Then he looked at one quote that was on the wall. And I like this quote a lot, so much so it's simple. That's why it's easy for me to remember in Tibetan. It says, let me see, Nangwa sem, sem tongpa, tongpa shungsuk, zungsuk dewa chenpo. Nangwa sem, sem tongpa, tongpa shungsuk, shungsuk dewa chenpo. So it's words repeated. Nangwa sem, which is appearances are mind. But in the Likmincha circuit, I think, unfortunately, they got too poetic. Right? They turn it into nangwa, they turn it into imagination. It's like, But appearances, meaning, you know, the things that appear to us, our sensory experiences. Nangwa sem, appearances are mind. Then sem, next line, nangwa sem, then this word here comes here, nangwa sem, then sem tongpa. Mind is empty. Appearances is mind, mind is empty. Then next line, tongpa shungzuk. Emptiness is co-emergent. It's innate. Meaning it's innate to all our experiences. It's not something concocted. Emptiness is not something concocted. It's not something that you have to bring about. Meaning, so when it says that emptiness is innate, innate is actually better than the literal translation is co-emergent. Then often that's like co with what? Right? Yeah. But the way the Tibetan is like, they don't need, you know, the other one. You kind of understand. But in English, you're like, co-emergent, co-what, right? Innate is good. Yeah? Emptiness is an innate quality. You see this, yeah? It's also empty. As in, it's innate, it's already there. You don't need to newly produce emptiness. It's not the case that form, emptiness. Yeah? Then that emptiness is the result of emptiness. But rather, emptiness. Yeah? So it's innate. Then, shungzuk, innate, this innateness is great bliss, Dewa Chenpo. Right? Meaning, when you get it, that this is empty, great bliss arises. So Kempo was looking at that, you know, the teacher, looking at that quote, and he was like, well, I don't know Bonpo or not, but this is Mahamudra, he goes. He said, I don't know Bonpo or what, you know, but this is Mahamudra, you know.
That's very good.
Yeah, this is Mahamudra. This is Dzogchen, you know.
You say co-emergent and self-arising are synonymous?
Different. Rangjung is self-arising, related concepts, but as a translation choice, then you are using another word. If you are a translator, you cannot interchange. Yeah? But innate, cognate, and co-emergent, you can kind of substitute. Yeah. Self-arising is pointing to a quality of awareness of Rigpa. It's a little controversial in the broader Buddhist context because everything is interdependently arising. What is this business of self-arising, you know? So it's like tantric vocabulary. Yeah. And if overused, especially to people who are new to the Dharma, I fear that it will create a kind of, it can be used effectively when you already get it, that everything arises interdependently. Then to say that awareness is self-arising becomes very powerful. But if too soon in your exposure to Dharma, you keep hearing and seeing self-arising, 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 then we're back to the God problem. You know, the theistic position.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Dr. Lai, before we close today,
Yeah.
I wanted to introduce you to Joyce Alford.
Oh, hello, Joyce.
She's become a member of our group. And,
Okay.
she took refuge with Lama Yeshe Wangmo, this
Okay.
sent by Lama Tarchin long ago.
Wonderful. Yeah.
So she's been around, but not lately, and she's come back to us.
Well, thanks for hanging out with us. I hope my Uvula talk and all that, you know, didn't scandalize you. And when I let my politics slip, apologies if that's not acceptable.
So far, I like your politics.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so yeah, good, thank you. I guess we have a retreat coming up, yeah?
Yeah.
So this coming Friday. And I will just so quickly, you know, I know we have to go. Cheryl, I will in the next day or two send you guys the like some sort of, you know, material, a booklet, yeah, that we're going to be using, and also like the Zoom information, yeah. So I'll get that all, you know, squared away and sent to you. And as we agreed, you know, I think we'll use the Urban Dharma Zoom so that EBS Zoom can continue to offer whatever you are doing to other people who are not involved in the retreat.
Thank you. So,
yeah, I've had people asking me about recording and participating, not in real time. I didn't want to make those decisions, so I just like, please talk to the organizers.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good thing. There's a lot of people. It's funny how now all of a sudden there's all this stuff going on since the pandemic. Like right now, people left this meeting because they're going to a Chud retreat with Nam Thupten. Okay. But anyway, it's so video recording makes it possible for people to see whatever they want. So I'm glad you agreed to that. And the other question has come up is people, could they do just part of it? Or do you want them to commit to the whole thing?
If they're going to do part of it, I want them to do the beginning part. I think it's distracting even for me to see on this, you know, like later somebody turns up and I'm like, do they know what we have done so far, you know?
I understand.
Yeah, so they can come at the beginning and go, but come later, I think is a little distracting.
Okay.
And
well, all of us here are signed up. There's a bunch of your people from other parts that are signed up too. 20 at this point.
Right. And it might not be a bad idea to maybe EBS also send out another like email to say, you know, we have the numbers that we consider ideal. So we're not necessarily looking for more, right? But if you can only do it like not in real time, we can also register you because we have now agreed that we will record and send you these recordings.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think actively saying that, you know, like if you want access. So for the time being, I'm not going to make them available on my side.
Yeah.
And we will withhold this like for a couple of months so that people who sign up, quote unquote, then will have access to it.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can say that and say,
Okay.
including there are people who got in touch with me from like Vietnam. I said, well, we are doing our retreat when you're supposed to be asleep.
Right. Time zones is a
Right. So
Yeah.
I said,
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to work, but at that point, I've not thought about the recording.
Right.
So I think if you send out, even like on Facebook, as well as your mailing list to say, after discussing, with the teacher and among ourselves, we feel that we can do this, and so please register and indicate, that you are not a real-time participant.
Mhm.
I think you might get a handful
Yeah.
of others wanting to do it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And as you know, I don't know, maybe it's just my own fantasy. Reason why I think people should, if they do part, they should join us at the beginning rather than in the middle, is because I tend to kind of slightly nuance things different from what most people.
Yeah.
And I want people to get that before they do more,
Yeah.
rather than come in and have assumptions that they have picked up from previous exposure to Dharma, and then it's a little jarring, Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else we need to do to prepare for the retreat? I mean, individually or no?
Headstands.
Well, we don't do those anymore. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's nothing
Okay.
really to prepare too much,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I don't want to take up all the time. I know that Jim and Betsy haven't said much yet, but Dr. Lai, I just wanted to let you know that Betsy and I are working on a preparing for death support group for Buddhists. And at some point, I would like to pick your brains about
Yeah.
that, because we have all this material from Tibetans. All the Tibetan communities have their
Yes.
stuff. But I also, because it's EBS, we also need to make sure we don't alienate the Zen people or the Vipassana people or whatever. So maybe we could talk about it with you. But the idea is that it's really very practical. It's just to help people get there together.
Yes. Yeah.
So we would meet once a month and there would be checklists and people would work through the process together, support from each other.
Yeah, sure. Again, the founder of Drigong Kagyu, Jigden Sumgen, I've shared this in the past. Even the way he talks about Poa is kind of different from what we know today as Poa.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, when it's pointed out, you're like, oh, he talked about how he said to his disciples, you might be called because of your position as a lama or monk, you might be called to go facilitate someone's dying and be asked to do Poa for someone who is, to be a wicked person, like a sinner, a wicked person. This is 12th century. So Tibet, there are bandits, there are robbers, there are people who kill and steal, all of that. And he said, even that, at that point, he said, you can effectively help this person. He said, you appeal to this person's love for his mother. And so this scenario is sort of like, you might be helping someone who's very proud, arrogant, and ruthless, and probably even in his dying moments think, I don't need anything. Yeah. There's still that, right? He said, you appeal to their love for their mother, and said, you might think, right, you're fine, But have you thought of who you're leaving behind and how they are going to go on as a way to soften their hearts? And he said, then this thought of care and concern will come up in this person's mind. And he said, and if this person can die with this thought, he says, then you have helped them to go to somewhere higher than what they would have gone if left to their own devices. He even says, maybe not to Amitabha's Pure Land, but you have helped this person to get to a better place already. And that, he says, what can be wrong about that? Yeah, then I shared, I said, there's a TV series, Outlander. Who has watched that? Yeah. So the main figure is, right, a nurse in the First World War that somehow time traveled back to ancient Scotland. Yeah, English First World War nurse, doctor, I think. She time traveled back, and in one of the earlier scenes, her captors, among a group that basically captured her, rebels, one of them was dying after a skirmish, bleeding profusely. And she came to him and comforted him that he was dying. And she, held him, and she basically talked to him and said, do you remember your village? The flowers must be blooming now. Do you remember the smells? So this dying person, in a lot of distress, just calmed down, and basically he died with a smile on his face. And I'm like, that's Poa.
Yeah.
That's Poa. That's Poa,
Well, at some point, we will need to talk to you, even those people who in this group who haven't taken refuge in you or in your lineage.
Oh, no. Refuge is only in Buddha Dhamma Sangha. Don't take refuge in people. Don't take refuge in lineages.
I know, but I mean that, that we need to, because I think we need to talk about at some point how we can help each other, and how we can, what help can we ask for from you when the time comes.
Sure.
Okay. Not today.
Yeah. So, okay. You all have a good Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
the sun is out over here. I don't know about over there.
Yes.
The hurricane is coming. Remnants of it is passing through you guys, yeah?
Yes.
Already gone.
Passed. We're
Oh,
going.
they passed.
We're
Okay.
done. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay. Good. Well, you'll have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Bye, guys.
Hey, defeat the enemy wrong. Build their sickness, death from the ocean, sorrow, may we all be free.
Hey, man.